What is going on, everyone, and welcome to my Abyss Glance build. This weapon just got a major buff to it along with Frost Vortex, and I am so excited for this build. So without further ado, let's get into it. Alright, so before we go over the weapon itself, we have to go over what is Frost Vortex. So, trap enemies within a 4.5 meter radius and inflict 50% PSI intensity as status damage per half a second for 4 seconds. That is new, we will go over that. And up to 1 Frost Vortexes may exist at any time. So a couple of things were changed here. This per half a second that you deal the status damage, this used to be 1 second. This got lowered down to half a second, which is actually a huge buff. It's only half a second, but that status damage triggering every half a second is so much better than the 1 second it used to be. And it's 50% PSI intensity. They actually buffed that up, so now it does even more damage. But the biggest change to Frost Vortex was that up to 1 Frost Vortexes may exist at any time. So this was always 2 Frost Vortexes, if not more, can exist at any time. So now across the board, no matter what weapon you are using, only 1 Frost Vortex can exist. Now, they did majorly buff the Frost Vortex damage. So this 1 Frost Vortex is going to be equivalent to the damage of 3 Frost Vortexes. So it is a huge buff. It doesn't look like it, but the devs majorly changed Frost Vortex. So now it's the best crowd control in the game. And as well, it does insane damage now. Alright, and so the way this weapon works, hitting enemies triggers Frost Vortex. Cooldown 7 seconds. Each hit reduces the cooldown by half a second. So what this means is that when I first hit this enemy right here, it is going to proc Frost Vortex, and it shouldn't proc it for another 7 seconds unless I keep on hitting the enemy. So, see? And then as I'm hitting enemy, the cooldown is going down and down, so I am triggering Frost Vortex on repeat even faster. So that is a big change to how Abyss Glance used to work. Abyss Glance never used to proc Frost Vortex that much, and so that feels super good. And then getting into the next part, Frost Vortex damage frequency increased by 100%. What this means, and this is new, it's kind of similar to how the barbecue gloves work on the Boom Boom. So as I'm shooting this enemy, you're going to see the Frost Vortex damage increase as it ticks up. So 68, 71, 84, and it goes all the way up to 101. That is the frequency increasing with the Frost Vortex damage as I am dealing damage to the enemy. That is a major buff to the Abyss, and that basically gave it most of its damage increase right there. So now it procs Frost Vortex more, and now it also deals a significant amount more of damage. And then moving on from that, hitting non-meta human units within Frost Vortex increases the final damage of self-created Frost Vortex by 5%, stacking up to 10 times. So that is just going to increase the damage of Frost Vortex as you are proccing it. So that's also another damage boost. However, that last line right there, 30% increase in Frost Elemental damage, that is big. That is a huge damage buff. So like if I just have the Abyss Glance equipped and I have nothing else on at the moment, so you will see that 30% increase of Frost Elemental damage will be right there. That is just a base 30% increase in frost damage. That is so nice. So not only do you get a base increase of frost elemental damage, you're also getting that frequency increase, and you're getting that Frost Vortex on repeat. So they completely changed the way that the Abyss Glance works, and it feels so much better than it used to, and I love it. I do really like the Abyss Glance. I used to use this weapon all the time when the game came out. Alright, so that brings us to the calibration. So the calibration you want to run on the Abyss Glance would be a heavy style double elemental calibration. Now you want the heavy style instead of the rapid style because the more bullets that you shoot, the more Frost Vortex procs that you are going to proc. Because the weapon, based on how many times you keep on hitting the enemy, that Frost Vortex cooldown goes down. So yes, technically rapid would get there a little bit faster, but you would have less ammo. So the heavy style is actually more beneficial and would do more damage in the long run. However, I do like the rapid style on the Abyss Glance, but the heavy style is just as good, if not better. Alright, and so moving on to the accessories for the Abyss Glance. So for the muzzle, we are going to want to run the multi-break. This is going to give it more range and more accuracy. For the optic, you are going to want to run the compact reflex sight for more stability. For the tactic, you are going to want to run the elite vertical grip. And for the magazine, you can't really change this, so it is just going to be a base heavy magazine. However, this is what you would want to run anyways, even if it wasn't locked to it. And for the ammo, we are running blue tungsten. However, the disintegrating rifle AP ammo would be the better choice for the Abyss Glance because you will deal 10% more damage to enemies affected by Frost Vortex. So I do plan on running this whenever I do get enough to actually afford it. So if you can't afford it, the blue tungsten's fine, or the AP tungsten is also fine. However, the disintegrating ammo would be the best ammo to run for the Abyss Glance for that increase of 10% damage. And so getting into the mod that you want to use for Abyss Glance, you want to use Cradle Blast. Now, this is sort of a new mod. They kind of just reworked the old Frost Vortex mods. So it's not new, but it is at the same time. It's just a reworked version. But Cradle Blast, after triggering Frost Vortex, increases Frost Vortex damage by 4%, up to 5 stacks, lasting 4 seconds. So what this means is every single time you proc Frost Vortex, you will gain 4% Frost Vortex damage. So if you do that 5 times, you will have 20% Frost Vortex damage. And the Abyss Glance does proc Frost Vortex, for the most part, super fast, depending on the enemy. So this is the best mod you can run for the consistent damage bonus that you're going to be getting. Now, getting into your secondary weapon, there will be 2 different ones that you can run. Both of them do the same exact thing, but work a little bit differently. So the first one is the D50 Wildfire, which is the one that I use for most of my builds. And the D50 Wildfire, you pull it out, you shoot up to 3 shots, and it will proc the bullseye proc. And the difference between the D50 Wildfire and the Bingo is that the D50 Wildfire will give you an extra weapon damage plus 25% for 10 seconds on a single target, which is beneficial for a lot of weapons. Now for the secondary you can run, it should be the Bingo, which as soon as you pull it out, you will mark bullseye on your first shot, and you as well will get extra weak spot damage %. So both of them are perfectly fine. I personally prefer the D50 Wildfire. However, at the end of the day, they both basically do the same thing in the end, and they both work very, very, very well. So the melee weapon that I am using is the Long Axe, which the Long Axe will proc Fortress Warfare, which Fortress Warfare will give you a little 20% damage boost for 5 seconds. So it's nothing major. Ideally, you would want to use something like the Kuriki, which would give you additional 15 crit rate and an additional 30% extra damage, and also 20% PSI intensity increase, all which are pretty massive. But however, I just haven't gotten that lucky, so I am using the Long Axe for now. The Long Axe is perfectly fine to use. It's honestly not that big of a deal. However, the Kuriki is the best melee weapon you could use for it. If you don't have one though, the Long Axe is perfectly fine, and you will get by just as well. Alright, so getting into the key item for the Abyss Glance. So the first one we have is the Frost Tactical Vest. Now this did just recently get buffed, and what this does is Frost Vortex generates ice spikes that deal frost damage of 120% PSI intensity. So that means when you proc Frost Vortex, ice spikes will form under the enemy, and they will deal 120% PSI intensity of frost damage. They did recently just buff that. It used to be 100%. So the Frost Tactical Vest is the big DPS one for all Frost weapons, because it will do that massive 120% PSI intensity Frost damage to enemies every single time you proc Frost Vortex. So this is the one that you want to wear if you want that massive extra DPS increase. Now the second key item you can wear for Abyss Glance, and this one is one of my personal favorite ones. I love this one for literally every single Frost weapon. Now, it won't do as much damage. However, the crowd control is kind of insane on it. So the second key item that you can wear is the Stealth Walker Wraps, which when Frost Vortex collapses in the center, it will keep pulling enemies in within 1.5 times the Vortex's range. So what this means is that when you proc Frost Vortex, it will spawn like a little ice crystal in the middle, and that little crystal is going to just keep grabbing enemies and pulling them in, and kind of makes it so like they're kind of useless, like they're just kind of trapped in there. And I've used this in a lot of like nightmare silos, and it's actually really strong. So yeah, you don't do as much damage as you would with the Frost Tactical Vest, but the amount of crowd control that you get from this key item is actually kind of insane and kind of worth it in a lot of situations, especially in stuff like Nightmare Silos, like Nightmare Silo Fee, for example, how all the enemies in this clip right here are just getting trapped inside the little ice circle. And I mean, they can't do anything about it. So you're basically just walking through these in-game activities, and yeah, I mean, that's it. That's game right there. I mean, so the Stealthwalker wraps are my personal favorite. However, if you do want the big DPS option, I would just go for the Frost Tactical Vest. Both of them are good. Both of them are meant for different situations. So now getting into the gear section of the Abyss Glance, there will be two different builds that you can run. One for low HP, high damage builds, and then the second build is for if you want to stay high HP. You still do really good damage with it. It just won't do as much damage as the low HP one. But for the first low HP build, you're going to be running with a 3-piece Treacherous Tide set. Now, 3-piece Treacherous Tide set, I use this for pretty much every single one of my builds now, because I mean, you can use it for pretty much every single build in the game. So what this does is at 2 pieces, when HP is below 70%, weapon damage and status damage plus 12%. So that is just going to be a base increase of 12% status and weapon damage. We're not really worried about the weapon damage too much. We do worry about the status damage though, because Frost Vortex is a status damage. And then at 3 pieces, the HP reduction from low sanity is decreased by 40%. Weapon and status damage plus 10%, and further increases as your sanity drops up to 28. So what this means is that at 3 pieces of Treacherous Tide set, you will get an extra 10% weapon and status damage increase. However, it can further increase as your sanity drops down up to 28% more. So that 28% status and weapon damage plus that 12% status weapon damage, you're looking at 40% extra status damage, which is huge. And the weapon damage doesn't matter as much. And so the 3-piece Treacherous Tide set is really good. And you can literally use 3-piece Treacherous Tide set with every single weapon in the game. I'm just going to say, yeah. I don't think there's a weapon that you can't use Treacherous Tide set with, because it has the weapon and status damage. And for the 2 extra pieces of gear that we're going to wear, we're going to be wearing 2 pieces of shelter, which is just going to give us an extra 8% increase in elemental damage, which is going to benefit the Abyss Glance even more. So not only are we getting 40% more status damage, now we're getting an additional 8% elemental damage. So, I mean, that's pretty big. That's pretty big right there. Now, for the second set that you can wear, if you don't like the low HP type builds, but you still want to do a lot of damage, you can go with a 4-piece shelter set. And 4-piece shelter set is going to do great damage still. It's not going to be like that tremendous drop of damage. It's still going to do extremely good damage. So at 2 pieces of shelter, you will get 8% element damage increase. All right, that's good. 3 pieces, each weapon hit grants 1 stack of Deviant Energy. Every stack of Deviant Energy grants 1% elemental damage, which the effect can stack up to 20 times. So you can get an extra 20% elemental damage on top of that 8% elemental damage. Now, when you do reload, you will lose half of those stacks, however. And that brings us into the 4th piece of shelter, which increase max Deviant Energy stacks by 10 and grant 2 additional stacks when hitting a weak spot. So this is where it gets really good. So now you're going to be getting an extra 10 stacks of the Deviant Energy. So for a total of 30% elemental damage on top of that 8% elemental damage. So you are getting a total of 38% increased elemental damage, and you're getting an additional 2 stacks per weak spot hit. So, I mean, you're doing So, I mean, you're still doing really, really good damage with this. I mean, you're getting 38% elemental damage. You're not going to get the 40% status damage plus the 8% elemental damage that you would get with the 3-piece treacherous tide set. However, 38% elemental damage is nowhere near bad. And I mean, this is totally a viable option either way. And if anything, I mean, I'd actually prefer to go with the 4-piece treacherous set over the 3-piece treacherous tide set. Now for the 1-piece, you can just wear a 1-piece lone wolf set, which will give you that magazine increase as well. But no matter which set you go for, they are both going to do extremely good damage. So shelter or treacherous tide set, either one, both of them are great options. And I mean, you can't go wrong with either or. All right, so getting into the mods for the build. For the helmet, we are going to be running Deviation Expert. A Deviation Expert will give you fire rate plus 10%. With status damage plus 20%. That status damage plus 20% is good because Frost Vortex is status damage. And that fire rate means we're going to be shooting even faster, so that's 2 big benefits for this weapon. We are as well running this in a lunar suffix for the elemental damage and that status damage increase. Now, if you don't have lunar mods, you can just wear talent mods. Those are perfectly okay as well. Lunar mods are just for the low HP, high damage build. Alright, so now getting into the mask mod, we'll be running Frostwave Wither. So this is not really a new mod. They kind of just changed all the Frost Vortex mods, so they are different now. But Frostwave Wither, Frost Vortex's final damage plus 30%, decreasing by 8% per second over time. So what this is stating is that when you trigger Frost Vortex, it would deal 30% increased damage. However, over time, it would decrease by 8% until you proc another Frost Vortex. So the whole point of this mod is to keep proccing Frost Vortex to keep getting that additional 30% increase in Frost Vortex damage. So this is the highest damage mod that you can wear for the mask mod for Frost Vortex because of that 30% increase in damage. And as well, we are running this in a Frost Vortex suffix for that Frost Vortex damage and that frost damage that we're getting on this. Now we did as well get Frost Vortex trigger chance. However, that doesn't really matter on a weapon like Abyss Glance. So really we're just after that Frost Vortex damage increase and that frost damage increase. As long as you get those two on the mask and weapon mod, you should be set. And then getting into the chest mod, we are running Critical Rescue, which Critical Rescue damage reduction plus 20% and healing received plus 20%. When HP is below 30%. So the only reason we're really running this is because it's a lunar suffix mod. We're really just going after that status damage and the elemental damage that we get from the lunar mod. Now, if you don't have this or you don't want to run a low HP build, you can just run the blue status damage mod, which will give you an increase of status damage. And I mean, this is probably the best one anyways to run. The only reason we're running a gold mod is because of that lunar affix on it. But if you don't have this, I mean, you can just run the blue suffix one. Now, getting into the pants mod, we will be running Elemental Resonance. So Elemental Resonance, for each instance of elemental damage dealt from the previous magazine, the next magazine gains elemental damage plus 1% for 15 seconds, up to 24%. So the reason we're running Elemental Resonance is because of that element damage increase that you will get after you reload every single mag. So as long as you are proccing Frost Vortex, as long as you are dealing damage for every single magazine that you reload, you will most likely have that maximum 24% increase in elemental damage. So this is very, very beneficial. Now, another really good mod would be Abnormal Increase if you didn't want to run the Elemental Resonance. So Abnormal Increase when the magazine is empty, status damage plus 10% for 12 seconds. The effect can stack up to 3 times. Sometimes I just like to use this mod because as I'm reloading, you will get a total of 30% increased status damage on your third reload. I mean, if you're doing salvos and stuff like that, then I mean, Abnormal Increase probably would be better than Elemental Resonance because you would be getting an increase of 30% status damage compared to 24% elemental damage. So, but either one works, whichever one you have the highest substats on, like element damage and status damage on the substats, that is what matters. And then getting into the gloves mod, we are running Elemental Overload. element damage increased by 18%. So our frost damage will be increased by 18%. Now, we are running this one in a talent suffix, once again, for the element damage and that status damage. So Frost Vortex is status damage. However, it bases its damage off Frost elemental damage. So by combining a mixture of status damage and elemental damage mods, we are essentially making it even stronger instead of just stacking all of one onto it. And then getting into the boots mod, we are running Rush Hour, which Rush Hour, every 10% HP loss grants 4% melee, weapon, and status damage. We don't really care about that melee and weapon damage. However, that status damage is big, so you can technically get up to 40% status damage depending on your HP. However, and I say this all the time, you'd be dead, which we don't want to be dead, do we? So really, you can get up to like 36% more status damage, which is still huge. We are running this one at talent suffix as well. If you didn't want to run this for the low HP build, I mean, you could run something like Covered Advance. However, I think Rush Hour is probably one of the best mods the devs have ever added into the game. And it's really, really strong for pretty much every single weapon. So, alright, and so getting into the Cradle, you are going to want to run Anti-Void, Status Enhancement, Tactical Combo, Elemental Sense, Extreme Freezing, and for your last three options, you are going to go for Tactical Leap to get that extra 20% damage against Deviants. Now you can get this from using the double jump drink, or you can even use Spring Legs just to keep jumping, and you will start to accumulate these stacks over time, and it's really easy to keep this buff up. And for the last two, depending on if you're running Nightmare Silos or not, if you aren't running Nightmare Silos, I would go for March Strike, and as well Bounty Hunter. Now, if you are running Nightmare Silos and you do need to deal with two different types of Deviants, I would go ahead and take off the March Strike, and I would put on either Anti-Phase or Anti-Coherence to deal with both of the Deviants that you need to take care of in the Nightmare Silos. Alright, so now getting into the food buffs, so we will be running Surprise Spring Roll for that 5 to 15% increase in elemental damage. Now that will actually double if your HP is below 40%. So technically you can get up to 30% increase in elemental damage. Now this is the one I usually run for every single elemental build, regardless of what it is, just because of that big 30% increase in elemental damage. Now if you are a chef class, this is going to pair extremely well with the second food item that we're going to talk about, and it would make it even better for bossing. However, if you are not a chef class, I would just go for the Surprise Spring Roll for pretty much everything for my food buff, because this will give you the biggest amount of damage increase. Now for the second option, we do have the Mixed Fried Hot Dog, which the Mixed Fried Hot Dog, if you do have a chef class and you stack this with the Surprise Spring Roll, it will do a lot more damage. However, if you are not a chef class and you are just doing bosses, just strictly bosses, I would pick the Mixed Fried Hot Dog over the Surprise Spring Roll in that certain situation. Now, if you are doing anything like Silos or Leah Labs or Zone of Haze, you know, that kind of stuff, just where you're running around a whole bunch, just not just single boss damage, I would pick the Surprise Spring Roll over the Mixed Fried Hot Dog. However, if you are a chef class, you can just use both of them. But those are the different situations that I would use both of them in. And for the drink buff, we will be running the Whimsical Drink, which the Whimsical Drink, I mean, there's no other really drink buff meant for status damage. So this is the best drink buff you can use for all status damage builds. It will give you that increase of 25% status damage. So that's going to be pretty big too. So this on top of the food buff, I mean, your Frost Vortex damage is going to be insane. Now, if you are a chef class, you can pair this with the double jump drink, and you can have double jump and the status damage increase. However, if you are not a chef class, I would 100% always pick the Whimsical Drink, 100% of the time. But overall, I really did enjoy making this build, and I really hope you guys like it. It is extremely fun, and I'm very glad about the new Frost Vortex changes. So I will see y'all next time.